Good morning, everybody. It is so nice to be here with you all. I am currently sitting here in Tel Aviv in the land of Israel, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So we are here. We've made it through the entirety of the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis. We're at Parsha Vayechi, and in a lot of ways, it's quite surreal to be in Israel finishing up the book of Genesis. Of course, reading the entirety of the Tanakh, any of the stories, gets a deeper dimension, a deeper level of understanding, actually being able to travel through the streets and the hills and the mountains and the towns and the cities that all of the biblical stories take place. And it really gives you a perspective of scope. I think in California and in America in general, we tend to think of geographical distances, say from one city to another or from one hilltop to the next, being these immense distances of dozens, if not hundreds of miles at times between cities. Whereas in reality, the entirety of Israel fits into California about 19 times. And so thinking about what that means every time we open up the Torah, every time we open the Tanakh and study the stories of traveling from one city to another, as Abraham did, as Isaac did, as his son Jacob did, and as in our Torah portion, we now have Joseph and his brothers doing the same thing. And even the distances we can see from Israel to Egypt, as we know, a common theme throughout the entirety of the book of Genesis, just to focus on the big picture for a second, is Abraham ends up having to leave the land of Israel because of famine, and so he travels down to Egypt. Yitzchak or Isaac ends up having to leave the land of Israel to travel south to Egypt because of famine. And of course, in this week's Torah portion, Yaakov, or Israel, as his name was changed a couple weeks ago, also travels from Israel to Egypt down south because of famine, where, of course, his son Joseph was already the vice king, the viceroy of the land of Egypt, which is, of course, how the entire Israelite population gets into Egypt once we go to next week for beginning of the book of Exodus. But we actually have one of the most enigmatic stories probably in the entirety of the book of Genesis. Perhaps one can make an argument for at least this being the most confusing singular action done by any character in the Torah, smack in the middle of this week's Torah portion. And just to open it up a little bit and just to start to describe the question, we get this touching scene where after years, Yaakov had assumed, he imagined, quite logically so, that his son Joseph had been killed. Again, if we remember from a couple of weeks ago, Joseph's brothers sold him as a slave to Egypt. They ended up throwing him into a pit. They took his dream coat, his multiple color dream coat. They dipped it in the blood of a ram. Again, many of the commentators symbolize that the blood of the ram was actually an allusion or a metaphor to the Akedah, that just like Abraham traumatized his son Isaac, so too the generational trauma is passed down, especially in the form of a ram. There's a lot more there in terms of Isaac and Jacob as well, perhaps for another time. But all of a sudden, Jacob, or Israel, reunites with Joseph and is now able to meet his grandchildren Ephraim and Manasseh for the first time. And here is what happens. Israel's eyes were dim with age. He could not see. So Joseph brought them close to him and kissed them and embraced them. Again, a touching moment. And Israel said to Joseph, I never expected to see you again, and here God has let me see your children as well. Joseph then removed them from his knees and bowed low with his face to the ground. Joseph took the two of them, Ephraim with his left hand to Israel's left, and Manasseh with his left hand to Israel's right, and brought them close to him. But Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it over Ephraim's head, even though he was the younger, and his left hand over Manasseh's head, thus crossing the hands, although Manasseh was the firstborn. And he blessed Joseph, saying, the God in whose ways my father Abraham and Yitzchak walked, the God who has been my shepherd from the birth of this day, the angel, Hamalach Hagoel Oti Mikol Ra, the angel who has redeemed me from all my harm, bless the children. In them may my name be recalled, and the names of my father Abraham and Isaac, and may they be teeming multitudes upon the earth. When Joseph saw that his father was placing his right hand on Ephraim's head, he thought it was wrong. So he took hold of his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh. So again, Israel is evidently, according to Joseph, making a mistake. Again, if you imagine that the firstborn son, which of course in the ancient world and all throughout the book of Genesis, again, think about the debate between Jacob had with Esau in terms of the rights of the firstborn, that the firstborn gets the quote unquote better blessing, and the right hand again represents strength and dominance. And so you would give the firstborn son your right hand. All of a sudden, Israel is switching the hands. And so Joseph, of course, corrects him. And he says, "Not so, father," Joseph said, "for the other is the firstborn. Place your right hand on his head." So Joseph figured that his father was making a mistake because, again, his eyes were a bit dim. He couldn't see. He was going blind. Again, another actually metaphor to Isaac going blind. The rabbis in the Midrash say that Isaac was blinded because Abraham, during the Akedah, was crying so much and his tears were so salty that they dripped into Isaac's eyes, permanently blinding him. Again, a poignant metaphor for parent-child relations all across the book of Genesis, which makes this story even more confusing because all of a sudden Israel objects, saying, "I know, my son, I know. He too shall be a great people. Yes, Manasseh, the firstborn, will be great. Yet his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall be plentiful enough for the nations." So he blessed them that day, saying, "By you shall Israel invoke blessing, saying, God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh." Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. What is Jacob doing? Again, think back to several weeks ago. The entire reason, according to a straightforward read of the Torah, as to why there was so much trouble all throughout the book of Genesis. We can go generation by generation. We can talk about Isaac and Ishmael fighting over who would have the love of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar. We can talk about Yaakov and Esau, again, fighting over the firstborn. We can, of course, talk about Israel favoring Joseph, thus leading to the ire and the jealousy of the brothers, ending up with him being thrown into a pit. It seems like Jacob hasn't learned anything. It seems like he's making the classic error of the book of Genesis, the classic error of showing favoritism. And if the book of Genesis teaches us one thing, if there's one takeaway in terms of family dynamics of the book of Genesis, it is that showing favoritism to a child is always going to end up in disaster. It never works well. And now that Jacob has the chance to meet his grandchildren for the first time, it seems like he's making a catastrophic error. So, of course, like all great enigmatic questions that really get at the roots and the fundaments of trying to understand what's going on, our sages, the rabbis, look for answers. And of course, the first place they look for answers is through later pages of the Tanakh. So we get all the way to the book of Jeremiah. And just a little bit of background, Jeremiah or Yirmiyahu was a prophet who prophesies at a couple of different times of Israel's history. He's sometimes thought of the prophet of doom. And oftentimes Jeremiah brings, shall we say, bad news to the Jewish people. He's oftentimes coming with strong prophecies of destruction and what's going to happen. But Jeremiah also ensures that he ends with a positive note. And some of our most beautiful prophecy, especially prophecy about one day returning to the land of Israel. Again, it has special significance as I'm sitting here in a hotel in Tel Aviv, that Jeremiah always ensures to end with a happy note. And so here's what Jeremiah says, and here's one of the ways in which our rabbis, our scholars, start to try to get at an answer. So Jeremiah is, again, prophesizing after a particular destruction of the northern tribes in the land of Israel, and here is what Jeremiah says. "Thus said God, the people escaped from the sword, found favor in the wilderness when Israel was marching homeward. God was revealed long ago, eternal love I conceived for you then. Therefore I continue my grace to you, I will build you firmly, O maiden Israel. Again you shall take up your hand drums and go forth to the rhythm of the dancers. Again you shall plant vineyards on the hills of Samaria. You shall plant and live to enjoy the fruit. For the day is coming when watchmen shall proclaim on the heights of Ephraim, come, let us go to Zion, to the eternal our God. For thus said God, cry out joy in Jacob, Shout out at crossroads of the nation, sing aloud in praise and say, save, O eternal one, your people, the remnant of Israel. I will bring them forth from the northland, gather them from the lands, from the ends of the earth, the blind and the lame among them, those with child, those in labor, in vast throng, they shall return there. They shall come with weeping, and with compassion I will guide them. I will lead them to streams of water by a level road where they will not stumble. For I am ever a father to Israel. Ephraim is my firstborn. So again, a beautiful, beautiful prophecy by Jeremiah, both acknowledging the destruction and also imagining, prognosticating, prophesizing about a future time in the Jewish people, a future time when one could imagine that everything will be whole again, that everything will be shalom, both in terms of shalom, in terms of peace, and shalom in terms of wholeness. But again, Jeremiah seems to have caught on to Jacob or Israel's error, because again, he says at the end of this prophecy, Ephraim is my firstborn. And again, our rabbis understandably are confused by this because, again, opening up Parsha Vayechi, Ephraim is clearly not the firstborn. Menashe is the firstborn, Ephraim is the secondborn. Jacob switches his hands and gives Ephraim the blessing of the firstborn. But this is leading scholars and commentators to imagine that perhaps there's something about this firstbornness, if we can coin a new term of firstbornness. Perhaps there's something about being a firstborn that's not literal. Perhaps firstborn, just like Jacob merited to receive the blessing of the firstborn. And by the way, just a little bit of interesting etymology. The word in Hebrew, bachor, for firstborn is bachor, and the word for Hebrew for blessing, which of course is barach, are the same letters. The only difference is the resh and the chaf are switched. And so a lot of commentators actually understand the firstbornness, again, to use our newly created word, to actually be representative of a blessing that actually isn't connected to the biological fact of being a firstborn. That's perhaps for a later time, but this line in Yirmiyahu and Jeremiah is pushing our rabbis, is pushing us as thinkers, as people who come to the Parsha every week to think about what is it about Ephraim that makes him into a firstborn, that allowed Jacob to switch his hands, again, seeming like he was creating that same tragic error that was so ubiquitous throughout the book of Genesis. We go back to Ephraim, and there's one more clue to try to figure out what is so special about Ephraim. Again, so far, all we know is that Jacob switched his hands and that Jeremiah, speaking in the name of God, has declared, again, hundreds of years later, the tribe of Ephraim to be the firstborn. And so we get one more clue, actually, a couple of weeks ago. And these are a couple of lines in the Torah that generally, when we read them, we go quickly through them because they don't seem to have that much meat and that much depth to it. But just to rewind the Torah a little bit, we are all familiar with Joseph predicting the famine that's going to take place in Egypt through interpreting Pharaoh's dreams. And we know that once that happens, Pharaoh elevates or promotes Joseph to being the vice king. And so Joseph becomes quite the popular, high-ranking official in Egypt. But again, Joseph is somebody who experienced a lot of hardship. The journey of Joseph, actually, the journey of Joseph is a fascinating metaphor for the Jewish people, but the journey of Joseph, one being constantly sold out by brothers, one being thrown in jail, right, falsely accused of a crime that he didn't commit. Again, there's so many metaphors, so many allegories to the wider journey of the Jewish people. And suddenly Joseph, through his faith, through his hard work, through his ingenuity, is able to rise up the ranks of Egypt. And so we find Joseph as the vice king in Egypt. And the Torah says before the famine came, Joseph became the father of two sons, whom Osnat, daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore to him. So Joseph is now having two children. Of course, we know Ephraim and Menashe. Joseph named the firstborn Menashe. And Menashe in Hebrew means God has made me forget, right? Sefaria is our friend here and tells us that the Hebrew Nashshani is where the root of Menashe is, and that means to forget. Because you have your firstborn, and Joseph is declaring that Menashe is, God has made me forget my hardship and my parental home. And so again, Joseph, as somebody who has an immense amount of trauma, who experienced a traumatic upbringing, many traumatic things happening to him in life, finally he has roots in Egypt, finally he has a wife, finally he has a kid, finally he feels like he has political protection, finally he feels content, and he has his firstborn, and he says, aha, now I am able to forget. Now I'm able to deal with my trauma in a way that I can push it aside, right? I can understand that, of course, my trauma, that the things that led me here happened in the past, but now I'm focused here on my firstborn, Menashe, the son of forgetting. And then Joseph has another son, and his second son was named Ephraim. And Ephraim comes from the Hebrew word Hephrani, which means fertile. And so Joseph names his second son Ephraim, saying, God has made me fertile in the land of my affliction. And so we take a step back with these two definitions, and we open up the pages of the Hasidic master, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And the Rebbe Lubavitch says something fascinating about the psychology of what Ephraim and Menashe both represent on a wider psychological scale. Again, zooming out to the 300,000 feet bird's eye view of what's going on here. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe suggests that when there's something traumatic that happens, there are two ways in which humans generally try to deal with their trauma through processing. One way is the route of forgetting, is to say, I'm going to push all my trauma aside. I'm going to attempt to lock it in a box, to push it over there, and to just deal with it and move on in a way that's not really engaging with the trauma, in a way that's centered around trying to forget. But there's a second way to deal with trauma, one that the Lubavitcher Rebbe suggests that Am Yisrael, that the Jewish people have done constantly over the last 3,000 years. And that's to actually attempt to thrive through trauma, to actually attempt to take the land, a barren land filled with the landscape of tragedy and lachrymosity and sorrow, and not just attempt to forget that, but see in the suffering, see in the tragedy, see in the sorrow, fertile land for planting the seeds and the roots and the trees of the future. And that's what Ephraim represents. Ephraim represents a people, a mindset, a philosophy, a theology of the world that suggests that, yes, there is affliction. Yes, Joseph might even be in the very land of his affliction. This is the place that he was sold into by his brothers. This is the place that he was falsely accused of a crime and thrown into prison. This is not a happy place for Joseph. But yet Joseph understood that in the wider landscape of sorrow, in the wider landscape of suffering, there can be seeds that are planted, that there's always hope. This morning, I had the honor of going to Kfar Aza. And sorry, I'm getting a little teary. I had to pause the recording for a couple minutes because I was in tears. The emotions of this place are a little bit deep at the moment. This morning, we went to Kfar Aza. And for those who know the map of the south of Israel, Kfar Aza is one of the places right on the border of Gaza. It's a lovely kibbutz, or was, about a mile east. And we saw the destruction. For those interested, I posted some pictures on Facebook, and there was multiple rounds already of people that went through and cleaned it. we walked around witnessing the destruction. I mean, words can't describe, of course, what we saw there. I mean, dozens of people murdered, dozens kidnapped from the village. This was a kibbutz that was specifically known for peace. It was a kibbutz that actually many of the members would take time volunteering to actually go to the Gaza border to drive workers from Gaza to different places around the south so that they can make a livelihood. You can make a lot more money working in Israel than in Gaza. And we're getting a tour from one of the residents who had numerous friends and neighbors, and she's lived there her entire life. She grew up there. And at the end of witnessing the destruction, of course, there's still trauma. Of course, there's still reckoning. But at the end, she spoke of hope. She spoke of peace. And we met the IDF general who's in charge of rebuilding the South. And he's talking about plans to take these kibbutzim that are rubble and they're destroyed, and there's bomb debris everywhere, and there's bullet holes in every wall. And there are some places that actually had to be destroyed because Zaka, the people who go and are in charge of collecting whatever pieces of bodies they can so they can have a proper burial, weren't able to clean the walls well enough. So they just had to demolish the wall because it was too tragic. The general talked about rebuilding the kibbutzim and making sure that more people move there and understand that we're not going to allow hate and evils to overcome. We met with the mother of Naama Levy, a 19-year-old girl, one of the most infamous kidnappings. There was a video of her being dragged in Gaza in bloody sweatpants. I apologize for the graphic imagery here. I've been around Israelis a lot, and they definitely do not hesitate to shock you with the most graphic of imagery, especially lately. And we met with her mother yesterday. And of course, as any mother is, she's troubled and deeply troubled by the fact that her daughter has spent 81 days as of the time of this recording, 81 days in captivity. And at the end, she spoke about hope and she spoke about faith. And the entire country here, it's incredible that the entire country here is the embodiment of Ephraim, is the embodiment of understanding affliction, understanding trauma, but also understanding that there is a future and that it's not just about forgetting, that remembrance, zachor, yizkor, tizkor, is not just remembering so we don't forget, but is actually attempting to build, looking towards the future, building and embodying hope. And just to end on a blessing, really a wish, a hope. And this is the end of Jeremiah chapter 31, this chapter that we studied before, and I'll read it in Hebrew first and then English because it's beautiful in the Hebrew. כה אמר אדוני מנעי קולך מבכי ועינייך מדמעה כי יש שכר לפעולתך נאום אדוני ושבו מארץ אויב ויש תקווה לאחריתך נאום אדוני ושבו בנים לגבולם. Thus said God, restrain your voice from weeping, your eyes from shedding tears, for there is a reward for your labor, declares God. They shall return from enemy's land, and there is hope for your future, declares God. Your children shall return to their country. Shabbat Shalom.